I will welcome everybody to the future of American elections, innovating for a more reflective government. I want to thank all of you for spending your lunch hour with us here today. I'm David Daley. I'm a senior fellow at FairVote. I'm just one of many people who've written a book with unrig in the title, and you will hear from more of that today. In the weeks leading up to the 2020 presidential campaign, FairVote has been conducting a series of virtual panels on the future of American elections. I don't think there is a more timely topic, and we have been talking with some of the most visionary thinkers in the electoral reform space about how we create the kind of democracy that lives up to our highest ideals and creates the kind of nation we all want to live in. This is the second of our conversations. I hope you will also come back and join us on October 1st at noon, when we will hear from the brilliant Harvard political scientist and philosophy professor Danielle Allen. And if you go to our website and our social media pages, you can find a link to our panel with Joshua Douglas, former Utah State Representative Rebecca Chavez Houck, and former Maryland Senate candidate and author Neil Simon. I am really excited for the conversation we are going to have today. I will pose the first couple rounds of questions, and then we'll open it all up to the audience. If you have questions you would like to ask, you don't have to wait. You can pose them now in the Q&A and the chat functions below. Emily from our FairVote team will be monitoring all of that. You can go ahead and leave those questions at any time. If you brought them in with you, if they occur to you as we are talking, go ahead and drop them in the chat. We've got a great panel today. Our two guests approach the topic of electoral reform from distinct but really often overlapping perspectives. We have a business leader who understood we needed a nonpartisan reform movement to help protect democracy, and an expert on the corrupting influence of money in politics who has expanded his focus to the bigger questions of how rules are rigged to help the few rule the many, and done so as a graphic novelist. So I want to welcome Daniel Newman. Daniel is a national expert on government accountability and money in politics. He has led MapLight since its founding in 2005. He's appeared in hundreds of media outlets. You've seen him on CNN, on CBS, on MSNBC, on Fox Business, on NPR. He's led a ballot measure campaign establishing public funding of elections in Berkeley, where he is talking to us from today. He was named one of Fast Company's 100 most creative people in business. And he had the brilliance to name his book Unrig, How to Fix Our Broken Democracy. We also have with us Katherine Gehl. Katherine is a business leader, author, speaker, and political innovator. She was the president and CEO of Gehl Foods, a $250 million high-tech food manufacturing company in Wisconsin. In 2015, she sold her company to focus on the urgent need for nonpartisan political innovation on both the state and the national level. She is the co-chair of the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers, a board member of Unite America, a co-founder of Democracy Fund, and founder of the Institute for Political Innovation. In 2020, she published another terrific book, The Politics Industry: How Political Innovation Can Break Partisan Gridlock and Save Our Democracy, along with her co-author, Michael Porter. So this is going to be great. I want to start by putting one word to both of you and asking what it is that you mean by it. And Katherine, why don't we start with you? You have written that our system isn't broken, it's fixed by a duopoly that controls our politics. Tell me what the word fixed means to you in this context.
Well, thanks, David. I'm glad to be here and glad to be here with Daniel also. So one word, but two meanings. Fixed. Politics isn't broken, it's fixed is my favorite attempted laugh line when I'm speaking, because we're bringing up the nature of the corrupt nature of the system. So sometimes if the people don't laugh, I actually have to say, as in like the mob, like criminals, you know, but usually it works. And that resonates because there is so much control by the political industrial complex, which is, you know, the parties and everybody else involved in profiting off of politics and that are currently profiting off the mess. So that's the first meaning. The second meaning is fixed. Politics isn't broken, it's fixed, as in it is a given that we will continue to get what we're getting because the system automatically delivers that. No matter who's playing the game, no matter what the faces are, no matter if we elect different people, because it's rigid and the incentives are fixed and the incentives are misaligned, which we'll talk about later. So the point is to stop looking at the wrong areas for change and look at what is fixed and wrong and incompatible with solving. Look at those two ways, then we can fix it. Or as Daniel would, and you would say, we can unrig it.
Tell me about the political industrial complex, because that is a terrific phrase as well. When you use political industrial complex, what is it? How does it work? And how is it standing in the way of the reforms we want to see?
Yeah, so some of your viewers will know that that term reflects a term originally coined by President.
Is it just me who has?
No, we've lost Catherine.
Or have we lost Catherine for a second? Okay, well, oh, I think Catherine's back.
Am I back?
I think you're back, great.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so this term was coined by Eisenhower, the military industrial complex, which is to say now post World War II, et cetera, there's a huge number of companies that wanted to keep selling defense products. And he was saying, oh, now they'll have more control over the national defense policy because their livelihoods depend on it. So the idea of saying political industrial complex, which by the way was not something that I created, other people came up with that idea first and I loved it, is that there are all these organizations, including the parties and the media and the consultants and the pollsters and everybody involved in the business of politics that make their money and grow their businesses by engaging in this industry. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I'm a huge capitalist, but when they're most successfully able to grow their power and influence by doing things that are at odds with what the public needs, then that industry is completely inappropriately regulated in a sense. So what we see right now is the political industrial complex is thriving. They're super powerful. They have more money, more power than ever. And the American public has never been more dissatisfied. In healthy competition, the customer would come first, and that's how the company would do well, was by serving the customer. And that's not what we have with the political industrial complex today. So that's what we have to change by changing the rules of the game.
Daniel, you chose an optimistic word for the title of your book, Unrig. Unrig suggests change and power. Tell me why you chose unrig and why, and what that word means to you.
Yeah, when we think about rig system, I mean, like Catherine said, the word fixed, rig, it's a similar concept. You think about like a rigged poker game, for example, there's two characteristics. It's hidden, like maybe someone's dealing off the bottom of the deck and you don't know it. And it's also, it's set up to have a predetermined result. And that's what politics, the political system is like Catherine said, the political industrial complex and all the factors that make a predetermined result, really regardless of the actions of everyday people. Now, if you want to unrig a poker game or a political system, there's two things that need to happen. First of all, you need to peel back the curtain and show what's actually going on, make it transparent. But that is not enough. You also have to rewrite the rules so they actually work for people, work for all the players in a poker game, or work for all of us and citizens, most importantly. And so I called it Unrig, really to put the focus on those two things, making it transparent and showing people what they need to do to change the system and exactly how you go about doing that.
Catherine, one of the central ideas of the politics industry, as you just talked a little bit about, is that competition is healthy and good, but that our political system, that political industrial complex that you've identified, works to undermine and to stifle competition, really in damaging ways, and that it reduces accountability. Tell me how you think ranked choice voting would improve accountability and competition. And then I'd also like you to talk a little bit about why you think RCV combined with Final Five is an even more powerful kind of reform.
Thanks. Okay, so let's talk about healthy competition first. So in any industry, in any other industry, as big as the politics industry, like a $16 billion industry, with this much customer dissatisfaction, so 90% of people are regularly, disapproving of Congress, we would see a new competitor come in to appeal to those customers to get a piece of that big business. But that never happens in politics because the two parties work together in this one particular way very well behind the scenes, and that is, again, use this word, to rig the rules of the game to protect themselves from competition and to optimize around structural rules that we already have to make it difficult for new competition to appear. Now, if you don't have competition or the threat of new competition in any industry, you're not driven to innovate and to produce results for the customer. So I actually have this conversation like all the time. Like I'll get my hair cut and I'll have the conversation with, the person cutting my hair, as in, well, imagine if there were only 2 salons in this entire town. You could cut hair really quite badly. You could charge whatever you wanted and you would still, have a lot of business. And that's essentially what we have in our political system, which is they can keep doing really well regardless of the results that they deliver. So that's what we need to change, is put the pressure on them. So how we do that is by changing these rules of the game, as Daniel said, and I propose Final Five voting, which is the combination of open top 5 primaries and then ranked choice voting in the general election. So let's start with the second, ranked choice voting, which Fair Vote has pioneered. God bless you. Ranked choice voting, I won't describe how it works. I'm sure your audience is pretty familiar with that. In my analysis, the most important criteria or the most important benefit of ranked choice voting is not that it's more fair, more representative, more democratic, although it's all of those things. If we want to think about accountability and results, the most important benefit of ranked choice voting is that it gets rid of the barrier to entry that keeps out new competition, which is the spoiler problem. So right now, if someone new, like a new party or an independent or a new kind of Democrat or a new kind of Republican wants to run, they're considered to be either a wasted vote or a spoiler vote, as in they're going to spoil the election for the candidate they're most like. So that's why we constantly only have 2, even though we don't like those 2 and we're choosing as the lesser of 2 evils because we're afraid to choose who we really want. When we implement ranked choice voting, the spoiler vote, the wasted vote goes away, and now new candidates, new ideas can freely compete. And that will drive accountability and innovation and results. And then the second piece that I propose to combine is that we need to get rid of party-controlled primaries, because party-controlled primaries, the Democrat primary and the Republican primary, push both sides far apart from each other, but not just in what they say to get elected, but in how they act when they're in Congress, which is they can't work together and they have to have lockstep allegiance to their party's, one line. Otherwise, they'll lose their next primary. So they're not really responsive to their entire district because they're only answering to the party primary voters which create effectively an eye of the needle that is so small that no problem-solving politician can pass through it. If we get rid of party-controlled primaries and replace them with open top 5 primaries and get rid of plurality voting and replace it with ranked choice voting, we will have truly incented healthy competition, which will then give our legislators the freedom to deliver results and the knowledge that they'll be held accountable with new competition if they don't.
Let me follow up on that just quickly, because there's been a couple of tough court cases in the last a few weeks. You had Arkansas and you had North Dakota, both of which were looking to put these reforms on the ballot box this fall, and you had state Supreme Courts in both of those states that went ahead and knocked them off. Is that also a sign of the politics of the political industrial complex, or is that a sign of state Supreme Courts that are also perhaps run by, appointed by partisans, loyal to partisans, and then looking for the technicalities to, knock these initiatives off the ballot with?
So, first of all, humans in general are resistant to change. And anyone who has done well in any industry, or not anyone, many people have done well in their industry do not want to see things change because they don't know how it would work under the new. So I would not say that just because people are resistant to changing these rules, it's automatically because they want to keep everything dysfunctional or because there's some evil, plan behind it. I'm not saying that can never be possible, but what I would say is it's really helpful to limit what we go after so that we can get agreement around it, which is why I propose that we really work to put Final 5 voting legislation on the ballot covering congressional elections only, so that it has much less effect on the state. There's one thing that people in the country now, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, it's that Congress is broken. They don't agree on whether the presidency is broken or whether the president himself is good or bad. They don't agree on whether the state legislature is broken, but everybody thinks Congress is broken. So I believe that the first step is to come together around something where we agree that is also a huge problem for the country, and that's Congress's inability to solve problems. And then we'll have opportunities in legislative states to move forward with that. And then in ballot initiative states, now, as you noted, we just got, turned back in Arkansas and South Dakota. We'll have to, or North Dakota, sorry. We'll have to look at those initiatives very carefully. And there's some part of that where we also just say we have to do a better job to protect them from challenges. And if we can't win them all, we win enough and then we go back. That's the way it is. I never thought it would be a straight line to success. So it doesn't worry too much.
Good. It's never a straight line. Daniel, you've talked about how in America, at nearly every level of our politics, it's possible for the few to rule the many. And I'm wondering how you think ranked choice voting might help change that situation. And in addition, what other reforms you think would be especially valuable at this moment in our democracy?
I think as Catherine said, that ranked choice voting really opens up the potential for competition. And that's competition in the world of ideas, really, as well as who can potentially have power. So if you have ranked choice voting, no matter what the candidate, they can't be dismissed as like it's not possible to win, because maybe they could win. It's a different situation. And so I think that, like, boy, our country really needs new dialogue and new ideas, right? I mean, we're facing so many unprecedented challenges. And I think that opening up the political debate is part of what campaigns do. I mean, who gets elected is very important, and we need to open that up. And part of ranked choice voting opens up who could get elected, but also what ideas can be considered and who gets into debates and who is in the news and such like that. So it's very important for that. The other one of the other reforms that I think goes so well with ranked choice voting is publicly funded campaigns. And that's as you mentioned earlier, David, and I led a campaign where I live in Berkeley, California, to have publicly funded elections, but this is also the law in New York City and Los Angeles and the state of Connecticut and the state of Maine and many other places. And right now, if you want to run for office at federal, state, or local level, one of the first questions people will ask you is not what are your ideas or what's your experience or what's your network, but it's how much money can you raise? I mean, think about that. That's how much money can you raise? It's a barrier. It's a huge barrier to who can run for office and win. And when Catherine's talking about lack of competition in politics, I completely agree. And the people who get elected from either party take funding from banks and pharmaceutical companies and many other wealthy interest groups. And so you end up with policies that benefit those interest groups. If you have publicly funded elections, then candidates can run for office and win with just small donations, without special interest money, and they can represent what people really want instead of special interests.
Let me just follow up on that too. The political industrial complex fights back. It has a lot of money and at its disposal. How have you and how would you propose holding on to reforms once they've been won by citizens?
So in every case, without exception, these reforms take place because there's groups of people and organizations that push them forward. And it's a pretty straightforward answer to your question, David. It's just to keep those networks together for defense. And there are always efforts, democracy and reform, it's never ultimately won. And it's always a process, and there's always forces that try to knock it back. But because of the organizing that it requires to get these things passed, is once they're passed, keeping those networks together, it's much easier to defend something once it's already in place.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I would love to know a little bit more about what brought both of you into this space. Catherine, your career started off in business. Why political reform? This has clearly become a real passion for you.
Yes. I will briefly tell you about what I call my 5 stages of political grief. So there I was a CEO, but also super concerned citizen, a parent. That's often the reason why people say they look and care about what's happening in the country, because they want their children to have a good life. And at first I thought, oh, I better stop just voting. I've got to get more engaged. So I worked on candidates. And then I realized, even when great candidates, in my view, won, that the results were still disappointing and similar. Washington, D.C. still didn't solve things. So then I said, okay, maybe not that. And then I said, I know, I'll work on policy. And I was very concerned about our fiscal situation. So I joined the CEO Fiscal Leadership Council of the Campaign to Fix the Debt. And then after a little while on that, I was like, oh, everybody knows what the broad outlines are of a rational fiscal policy for the country. And behind closed doors, they're reasonably in agreement, but nobody does anything. I know, I'll work on culture. And so then I joined and was an early supporter of an innovative effort to bring people together and sort of work across the aisle, a whole bipartisan, we're going to be friends effort. Super laudable, and many people in Congress were supportive, and yet in the end, they voted the same way. Even though they said they wanted to work together, they voted party line. So I was like, okay, so that's not going to work. So I went back to candidates, and then I said, oh, now I'm going to work on candidates, but they'll be independent, not beholden to the duopoly, and then we couldn't get those people elected. So finally, last stage of political grief, oh my gosh, it's the system. I got that from Mickey Edwards, former congressman from Oklahoma. It's the system. And I could never unsee it. I can't believe it took me that long to see it, because I'm a systems thinker. And then when I saw, that, and also saw that there were solutions, and saw that business people were missing in action, and I was one, business people thought politics was just so irrational. And so I determined that one of the things I wanted to bring to the political conversation, the political change conversation, was this analysis of competition and this way of showing business people and business leaders that the behavior in politics is every bit as rational as the behavior in any other business and industry. And so it's available for change through changing the incentives, the leverage, et cetera. And that's what I now do. And it's hard. I mean, you know that. It takes a long time, but it's also super rewarding because I think we have a chance. I know we have a chance.
Daniel, you have a fascinating path to the political reform world as well. I'd love if you would share that. But also if you would talk about the decision to present these stories and reforms as a graphic novel.
Sure. Well, I had my light bulb moment on this, David, when I was 19 years old in college. I was a big fan of playing pinball. And I was reading this trade magazine about the pinball industry, and it had this full page photo of a convention center in Washington, and all members of Congress and their families were invited to go down and play the latest pinball and video games. And at first I thought, wow, this sounds great. I wish I was a member of Congress. And then I started reading the article, and it was all about trying to get Congress to pass a new dollar coin, because at the time the Susan B. Anthony dollar wasn't getting a lot of circulation. And why did they want a new dollar coin? Because more people would drop them in pinball machines. And I thought, this is nuts. What a crazy way to run a country where the whole monetary system of our country is being pushed just so that more people drop money in pinball machines. Wow. And I had that insight, and then over time was able to pretty easily extrapolate that out to every other decision made in our country, and whether it's really made in the citizens' best interest or not. So I've been running MapLight Political Reform Organization for 15 years, and I've read a lot of books on democracy, and I wanted to write one that would actually be fun for me to read, and that's why I wrote Unrig. It's a collaboration with the talented artist George O'Connor, and it's a comic book. It's a 250-page nonfiction comic book. It's very heavy on stories of actually people who are making change happen. And so it's optimistic, it's positive, and it shows you specifically what you can do to change the system. I think that all of us in this broad democracy reform movement are trying to reach out to as many people as we can. And I think that in a graphic format, in a comic format, there are so many people that can engage that wouldn't necessarily read a prose book.
Were there a couple of reformers who you met and interviewed in this process who maybe you weren't aware of at the beginning, whose stories just dazzled you with regards to what citizens can accomplish when they organize and fight?
I've been continually uplifted by the 10 people who started Honest Elections in Seattle. So Seattle, as your viewers may know here, has the country's only democracy voucher system. It means every citizen in Seattle gets $100 in coupons in the mail, and they can use that to give to the campaigns of people for city council and mayor. And so people can run for office and win without dependence on special interest money. And the system is a couple of years old, and it's been working great. So that whole system, which is a national model, it started with just 10 people who said, let's make something happen. And it was such a privilege to recount that inspiring story in the book. And I would call it kind of warts and all. And what I mean by that is, like, they didn't succeed the first time, and they had to go back and try again, and they built a bigger coalition. That's the reality that you don't often see, like in the news, of how these things happen. But that's a story to bring to people, that I'm pleased to bring to people, to show that the intricacies involved and what it actually takes to make change happen.
I want to turn to some of the great questions we've got here from our audience. And here's a good one. Assuming most of us here get it and understand that the system needs to be reformed, how would you reply to this question? Which one reform would you do first? I'll pose that to both of you.
I would say that there's no silver bullet, and all these things work together. There's no one thing that's going to change it. And so I would say, what are people organizing on in your state? I advise people to focus on the state level. Most people pay politics either what's going on nationally or what's going on in their city. Not enough people pay attention to state governments, but state governments have a lot of power. So get together with all of the many fine groups that are working at the state level. There's a list on my website, unriggedbook.com. You can also look at FairVote and other websites. And whatever it is that they're putting forward, that's the secret. If we have, if there's 10 people all working on 10 different things, nothing gets done. But if you have 10 people all working on the same thing, then things happen.
I agree with Daniel. People should get engaged in a campaign in their state. And when I say campaign, I don't mean for a politician. I mean campaign for changes to the rules of the game. And because Article 1 of the Constitution gives all the states the ability to make the rules for the federal elections, that's where we need to go to get rid of party-controlled primaries and to implement ranked choice voting. I absolutely agree. There's no silver bullet that creates like a utopia. Winston Churchill said, you know, democracy is the worst form of government out there, except when compared to all the others. So sometimes people think I'm over-promising on what Final Five voting could deliver, but what I would say is Final Five voting won't make that democratic utopia because there isn't one. Democracy is messy and hard, but right now we have messy, hard, and bad results. If we get healthy competition, we'll have messy, hard, and a certain number of good results to show for it. So I really want to see us create the conditions for healthy competition as the highest priority for two reasons. One, because it really is powerful enough to change results, but two, because it's doable. So for example, there are things that would be powerful, but might take a constitutional amendment, which could be highly, highly unlikely for the same reasons that our current system is so dysfunctional. So in choosing to focus on Final Five voting, I wanted to get at really a sweet spot of something powerful enough to make a difference, but also not, it's hard to get done. It's just not virtually impossible to get done. And I believe easier than what we think, and actually not all that extraordinarily expensive in the sense of the relative dollars that go into politics. So I'm for Final Five voting first.
We have a good direct question from someone in the audience who says, a Final Five, the primary sounds like a way to keep third parties off the ballot. Why not just eliminate primaries altogether?
Oh, actually, I think Final Five primaries are a great way to get third parties on the ballot. So right now, and when I say that, I don't want to get third parties on the ballot in a way that nobody's ever heard of them until they show up that day to vote and go, oh my gosh, who are all of those people? That's not a victory. We want to see third parties and independent candidacies on the ballot in a way that has voters hear of them and hear of their ideas in the healthy debate that Daniel was talking about during the period between the primary and the general, instead of just, you know, wonder who those names are on the day of voting. So Final Five primaries allow those parties and those candidates to run in the primary and to be on the general election ballot coming out of the primary, which means that they've already passed a test of legitimacy. And because with Final Five voting, even if they're not considered likely to win, they'll have an impact on who does win. They're going to get earned media all along, which is another lowering of a barrier to entry, because they're making a difference from the moment, they're impactful on the election from the moment they make it through that primary. So in some states, it's quite possible that candidates and parties, depending on how a state implements this, could still choose to get on the ballot just through signature requirements. I wouldn't recommend they do that, because then they'll continue to relegate themselves to the hollow win of we're on the ballot, but we make no difference. This is, you're on the ballot and you make a difference.
We have a question from Alex Counts. And Alex has figured out the way to get his questions asked. He often likes my tweets on Twitter, so I see his name, and I'm like, I'm gonna bump that question up to the top of the queue. He wants to know about the hope that a decent number of the former felons, the returning citizens in Florida, will be able to vote in November by having people pay their court fees. And Daniel, you've got a terrific chapter on voter suppression and kind of the history of these laws nationally and how they've been used to keep people from the ballot box. Would you give people maybe an overview of the amendment fight in Florida in 2018?
Yeah. So I mean,
this
is still playing out in court, but really, so if you go back to the end of the Civil War and constitutional amendments that let African American men vote, but the white wealthy Southerners in power wanted to still control politics, even though there was this constitutional amendment that let African Americans vote. And so they, the end of the amendments ending slavery said that you could actually still lose your vote in indentured servitude. And what this basically meant that that if you were convicted of a crime, then you could lose your vote. So it's an exception, it's right there still in the Constitution. And so African Americans were arrested and charged with felonies on trumped up charges. And so what this eventually led to the disenfranchisement, which is the elimination of the right to vote for enormous aspects of the population. And this is true in Florida and other states. And these laws, 100 years later, still persist. And so this constitution, this Florida ballot measure undid that and said that after you have finished your sentence, convicted felons can then vote again. They restore the right to vote instead of permanently lost it the way it was before. Now, the Republicans in the Florida legislature really don't want these voting rights to be restored as the people of Florida voted. And so they said, well, we're going to count any money that you owe to the government as part of the sentence you have to serve before your vote is restored, but really doing anything they can to try and keep people from voting. And so there's, it turns out that the state of Florida can't even tell people how much money they owed. So the whole thing, from my point of view, is this continuation of over 100 years of suppressing the vote and just making it more difficult for people to vote. And that fight is still going on in Florida as the larger fight on voter suppression continues to go on 100 years after the Civil War, and it's very live today.
It's amazing how those laws from that period of time still entrap people, even up to this moment. Kevin Baker asks, when you talk about a fixed system, and he's moved on to say, do you mean like fixing the number of U.S. House members at 435 based on a census from more than 100 years ago? Catherine, do you think an expanded House might be a positive reform that would perhaps take on some of the entrenched issues that you have diagnosed?
I think that going back to this, there's no silver bullet. I think that we have to pay attention to the rules of the game ongoingly. And we have to look at the way competition is playing out in our politics industry and whether it's tilted towards solving, problems in the broad public interest or tilted towards special interests out for themselves. And things like expanding the House have been brought up as one of the antidotes to that. and there are, I mean, I won't quote you, there are reasons to think, you know, perhaps that could be helpful. What I keep coming back to is, if you had more people in the House right now, but you still had only two choices, Democrats and Republicans, or in gerrymandered districts, essentially, you know, you really only have one choice, it wouldn't make any difference. Now you'd have 800 people not getting anything done instead of half that amount of people not getting anything done. So that's why I think that restoring healthy competition on dimensions that serve the public interest is the first step. And then you may not need, you know, more people. Sometimes we want to change things, and I brought this up earlier. We want to change things because they're not fair and they're not democratic. And this is democracy, and I love our democracy. So I want everything to be fair and democratic and representative. And we have to aspire to that. But what Americans and every people want, every bit as much as they want freedom and representation, is they want results. So we shouldn't not tell ourselves that the best we can do is to get better represented in getting nothing done. We should get better representation and better results, which means that we have to change the incentives that govern re-election instead of just, quote unquote, changing, for example, the number of people who can get elected. And because that's available to us in the form of Final Five voting, that's what we should do first. And then we can look at the value of other ideas to add on to that and reinforce and sort of extend the benefits of healthy competition towards the public interest.
Now, Fair Vote's gold standard of political reform has been the Fair Representation Act, which combines multi-member districts, a larger multi-member districts for the U.S. House with a ranked choice voting would go a long way towards electing Democrats from Oklahoma and Kansas, Republicans from New England, where there aren't really any at all right now in the U.S. House, and trying to re-incentivize those electoral standards you were talking about as members seek a re-election, and perhaps re-incentivize them to behave differently, and perhaps try to come together on issues once in office. I see a lot of interesting comments on the Fair Rep Act in our chat. I don't know if either of you have looked at the idea of multi-member districts and ranked choice voting. I see you nodding your head, Daniel. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea, actually, and it lends itself well to comics in my book. So I actually have a lot of colored dots representing people of different parties and showing you just get people who elected who better represents the population. I mean, you mentioned 435 members of Congress. Like, why should they all be elected one by one? If you elect them in groups, you just get a legislature that better matches the population. Now, interestingly, most other countries have modern democracies that were instituted after the United States, and like democracy technology has improved, and actually other countries have multi-member districts or proportional representation, which is a variation of that. And so the US, which was early in kind of modern democracies, but really our technology hasn't caught up, and that's the kind of rules we need to change.
Let me comment on that too, if you would, David. I agree with Daniel. Yeah, we pioneered, and then we stayed with our original ideas, which is goofy, because now with experience, we can learn about other ways to, run the democracy, and there are innovations that move us forward. Having said that, I wouldn't say that the other countries that use ranked choice voting and proportional representation or multi-member districts are necessarily, winning dramatically at this sort of does the democracy deliver results game, which is what we really need to concern ourselves with. And I am not a fan of proportional representation and multi-member districts, because what we're going to do when we do that is we're going to have more people beholden to their small slice of the electorate in that district that gave them their victory, which means that now they're not answering. So let's say we have 5 representatives elected out of one district, and someone says, oh, I got elected through the votes of this particular constituency. That's who I'm going to advocate for because those are the votes I need again to win again. I think that will contribute yet again to having more representation, but no more incentive to work together to develop compromise solutions with difficult trade-offs. I don't just want more people representing all the different views. I want more people representing the views who can then come together to agree with people who represent different views to do something that moves the whole country forward. But if we just do proportional representation with ranked choice voting, we'll have people who will just stick with their views till the end, whether or not we solve a
I think we may have lost you just for a moment there, and I think we ought to come back to that topic, and perhaps we can do an entire conversation just on the Fair Rep Act and different senses of reforms and how to go forward. Let me go back to some of the questions from the chat in our last 12 minutes or so. Valerie asks, how does increasing competition address systemic racism? The game will still be rigged against people of color. Either of you have thoughts on how these reforms might help fix those very difficult questions of representation? Daniel.
Yeah, so right now with our country's heightened focus on racial justice, let's take one part of that, of police violence. So one of the key levers of accountability for police violence is district attorneys, typically an elected position who has a discretion whether or not to prosecute police officers accused of misconduct. In our current system where there isn't much competition and you need a lot of money to run for office, many district attorneys get that money from police unions. And so you have district attorneys deciding whether or not to prosecute police officers accused of misconduct when they've actually depended on campaign money for those very same police officers. And of course, they're not going to do as good a job looking out for the public interest as a whole. If you have systems like ranked choice voting, publicly funded elections, it opens up the system so that more people have the potential to run for office, have their ideas considered, and win without dependent on money from police unions, and you get better police accountability.
Yeah, and I will also say that this is just an enormously critical issue for us as a country to, I don't know if I would say finally, I mean, progress has been made obviously in the past to a certain degree, but now we have got to get this addressed. We cannot still be here, 3 election cycles from now. So here's the point that I think is important in healthy competition. Right now, when we only have 2 choices, a lot of people with a cause need to choose one of the 2 choices that says they're for that cause. And then they have to keep choosing them because they keep saying they're for solving that issue, even if they don't actually really make much progress on it. Because at least they're saying that's what they care about. But they don't have to deliver. So that is why we need new competition. So then people who really care deeply about not just systemic racism as the result, but about changing certain policies and systems that government, oversees or within the government itself that are contributing and exacerbating that systemic racism, they could take their business, their votes, to a new competitor who said, I'm actually going to get something done. I'm not just going to give lip service to this better than the one other choice, I'm gonna actually do it. And then that will put pressure on the whole system, both of the existing duopoly parties, to make change there. But right now, on any issue, systemic racism or any other issue we care about, the only thing either side has to do is say they're for it to win those votes. With more competition, they'd have to achieve something on it to win those votes.
It's a good segue into this question from a viewer who wants to thank you for both of your books and say, how do you both see and think about the growth of Americans who are leaving the two parties and becoming independents, now over 40% of the electorate? Are they an important engine in the coalitions for reform?
Yes, they are. They should be people who now, I mean, I think even people who still identify as Democrats and Republicans, and I ceased being one of those people a long time ago, I call myself politically homeless, you know, even one other choice. And so I think independents who have clearly now decided I'm not A and I'm not B are the ones who offer a unique, original opportunity to buy into changes like the ones I propose in the electoral structure, so that they'll have choices that reflect what they would like to see in representation. And again, the whole point of more competition is not just to change who gets elected, but change what winners do. And you'll have people competing who won't.
I think we might have lost Catherine again.
Maybe I'll just jump in to add to some of her points. I think that people opting not to be identified with one of the major political parties is it goes right along with the huge numbers of people that don't vote at all, and it's a general dissatisfaction and disengagement with the way things are. I mean, in the last presidential election in 2016, 60 million people voted for Donald Trump, 63 million people voted for Hillary Clinton, but 90 million people didn't vote at all. And these are just the signs that are all around and have been there for decades of dissatisfaction with how things are. And it's the engine of change that Catherine is referring to in terms of a market that's not being served.
And the beauty, I think, of the reforms that you talk about in UNRIG that were won by citizens is they weren't won by political parties. They were won by citizens, and they were won by citizens working together across all kinds of different party lines, right? I mean, that's one of the beautiful things about Florida. It's one of the beautiful things about the redistricting fight, the ranked choice voting fights, is that these are really citizens coming together across these party lines. And when these things win at the ballot box, they win with 60, 70%. It's hard to find almost anything that is able to win quite like a democracy reform across party lines.
It is. There's a story in the book of the badass grandmas. That's what they call themselves. It was a team of grandmas, a Republican, a Democrat, and an independent were the chairs of this large grassroots campaign to put together to end secret money in elections in North Dakota. And so now all political spending has to be transparent. And that's one of the many political reforms that are so broadly agreed upon across the political spectrum.
I love the badass grandmas.
I want to be a badass grandma.
Oh boy. Yes, indeed. I think we should all aspire to the power of being a badass grandma. I want to thank all of you for being with us today. I want to encourage everybody to buy Catherine and Daniel's badass books, The Politics Industry, How Political Innovation Can Break Partisan Gridlock and Save Our Democracy, and Daniel's UNRIG, How to Fix Our Broken Democracy. Daniel, I saw a question in there earlier for your website because somebody wanted to know where to go to find that list of groups. So
it's on unrigbook.com.
unrigbook.com, so go and check that out for sure. We are going to do this again on October 1st with Danielle Allen. So I hope we will see all of you in about 2 weeks for that. I'm allowed to tease perhaps another one of these in the middle of October with another name that I think you will recognize and appreciate. So stay tuned to FairVote's social media feeds, and we will announce all of that there. Thank you to Emily, to everybody at FairVote who has been live tweeting and making this happen. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Daniel. We appreciate all of you spending your lunch hour with us. Stay safe and make sure you are registered to vote. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.